So, the Famas. Like an old dog that's seen some better years, the Famas has been around in almost every iteration of the Counter-Strike series, remaining a solid weapon choice throughout, but never quite achieving that superstar status.
Why burst fire? That's why.
Of course, the gun is nowhere near irrelevant. But with the recent meta shifts in competitive CSGO, it sure seems like the Famas may have already seen its peak. But why is the gun slowly declining in popularity? Has it always been overshadowed by better alternatives? And what makes it the most disappointing gun in CSGO? Now, before we get into the bulk of this breakdown discussion, we first need to take a quick look at the weapon statistics. As always, I won't be discussing all of its weapon statistics, but just the ones that I find to be important and/or interesting. Like usual, all of the statistics used today can be found via Sloth Squadron spreadsheet, which will be linked in the description box below. So, to start things off, at $2,250, the Famas fits into the role of a somewhat cheaper, budget assault rifle for the CT side, containing a smaller magazine size of 25 bullets with 90 in reserve. As such, the Famas has a weaker raw damage than say the M4 or AK-47, but it's still respectable enough to not literally be the lowest. However, in terms of armor penetration, the Famas ties with both M4 variants for the lowest AP value at 70%. Likewise, it also maintains the average rifle fire rate, penetration power, and of course the inability to score fatal headshots against Kevlar helmets. In addition, the Famas also provides a decent rifle mobility at 220, but contains the worst rifle damage drop-off at 4%. Now, as one of the only two weapons capable of switching into burst mode, the Famas technically does contain the fastest assault rifle fire rate at 800 rounds per minute, when shooting on burst. But I'll get into why that really doesn't matter later on in the discussion. For now, combining its base damage, full auto fire rate, and more, the Famas ends up with a pretty solid rifle DPS of 322 against unarmored opponents, matching other rifles like the Galil and SG-553. However, when factoring in armor penetration, the Famas's DPS output drops significantly to 226, which surprisingly is only the second worst assault rifle DPS, as it beats the silenced M4 by a value of 2. It's pretty strange to see the M4A1S at the bottom of the armored DPS list, considering its widespread usage against armor. Then again, there are plenty more factors to deliberate. For one, the Famas contains a rather lengthy rifle reload time. At a 1.63 second clip and 3.3 second fire ready time, the Famas takes a total of almost 5 seconds to properly reload. While still under the AUG's reload time of 5.3 seconds, it's still well above the assault rifle average, and it definitely doesn't help to have 5 less bullets per magazine. Worse still, we have yet to take a look at the Famas's inaccuracy statistics. Now, in the interest of time, I've condensed all of the assault rifle's standing, crouching, and running inaccuracies for ease of comparison. But as usual, I will be explaining things as we go. So, at first glance, the Famas seems to perpetuate fairly poor inaccuracy statistics all around. For starters, it contains both the worst standing inaccuracy at 10.45 and the worst crouching inaccuracy at 7.99. In spite of this, these inaccuracy statistics are certainly serviceable, and even good in comparison to the average SMGs. But considering the fact that both values are almost double that of the M4s, it certainly makes them less than desirable. Of course, I haven't forgotten the Famas's burst mode inaccuracy, which may seem better on paper, but again, we will discuss why its bursting capabilities don't make much of a difference in actual competitive play. As for running inaccuracy, the Famas does have one of the lower inaccuracy values in comparison to the other assault rifles. But realistically, any gun with a running inaccuracy of over 100 plus is pretty much unreliable. Anyhow, moving on to recoil and inaccuracy from firing, things do seem to get a bit better for the Famas. With an average recoil of 20 and a firing inaccuracy of 6.7, the Famas is under the majority of assault rifles in these specific regards. Unfortunately, that's still not enough to offset its standing/crouching inaccuracies when factored together, as the Famas almost doubles or even triples that of other rifles in terms of degree and area inaccuracy. But there is a silver lining, as the Famas does retain something of a manageable spray pattern, at least for the first half of the spray. Similar to the UMP, compensating for the Famas's recoil basically involves pulling downward in a vertical fashion, and then adjusting to the right near the end. Unfortunately for the Famas, not only is its pattern less straight than the UMP, but it's also the inverse of most standard assault rifles such as the M4 or AK-47. Nonetheless, even with its wavering pattern and inverse spray, you'd probably be better off on just focusing to correct for vertical compensation. Although, due to its recoil and inaccuracy statistics, adjusting to its vertical compensation does take some getting used to. With that said, just how should you use the Famas? Contrary to what the meta now suggests, the Famas is not completely useless. Yes, there are better alternatives, which I'll get into in a bit. But the point remains that the Famas is still quite deadly, even when used, quote, incorrectly. How do I mean? Well, normally people expect the Famas to be only used at longer ranges, due to its limited ammunition, long reload times, and burst firing capabilities. Of course, there's no doubt in my mind that it certainly can be used as such, but I actually prefer to use it in close to medium ranges. Sounds weird, I know, but hear me out. Even with the worst assault rifle inaccuracy statistics, the Famas is actually easier to aim than the UMP for close to medium ranges, mostly due to its tighter spread. Admittedly, the difference is slight in CQC, but it does noticeably improve at semi-medium ranges, thus requiring less ammunition per kill, which is especially important for a weapon containing a reduced magazine size and a 5-second reload time. While that does emphasize the need for a more attentive trigger discipline, that honestly shouldn't be too big of an issue if you're already used to using the UMP or even the M4A1S in such situations. That being said, obviously I suggest switching to your pistol instead of trying to reload at closer ranges. Sadly, the same inaccuracy statistics that make the Famas decent for CQC are not nearly as forgiving when engaging at longer ranges. Again, with the worst assault rifle inaccuracy, the Famas is rather difficult to spray and control. While it's absolutely possible to improve spraying effectiveness through patience and practice, you'd probably be better off manually bursting instead. Unfortunately, bursting with the Famas while AD-AD moving is still rather disappointing, as it's noticeably worse in comparison to almost any other assault rifle. As inconsistent as manual bursting may be, it's still your best bet during long-ranged engagements, as tapping with the Famas is not nearly as consistent or effective as you'd hope, not to mention the weapon's lack of lethality against Kevlar helmets. Wow, but if burst firing is so good, why don't you just keep the Famas on burst firing mode? Why not? So, besides the obvious point of burst mode limiting the Famas's close-ranged utility, as well as making an audible click noise for all to hear, it's honestly not better than burst firing manually. Now, to be fair, the first shot in burst mode is supposedly 100% accurate. However, shooting in burst mode introduces a lot more recoil than manually firing. Simply put, burst fire mode has a lot of recoil, but very little horizontal inaccuracy. I know that may sound good in theory, but in practice it makes recoil compensation that much more difficult at longer ranges, not to mention having to readjust your crosshairs in unison with the burst mode's cooldown time. Remember, recoil is magnified the further out you go, so even slight deviations can turn a hit into a miss. In this case, the increase in vertical recoil is not worth the trade-off of reducing horizontal inaccuracy. Plus, manual burst firing is not limited to groupings of 3. Personally, I like to burst anywhere from 2 to 6 bullets, as compensating for those shots is pretty much just a straight vertical pull. Again, because the FAMAS cannot one-shot against Kevlar helmet, I almost always prefer my FAMAS to shoot a tighter grouping of more bullets rather than a looser grouping with less. So unless you're really uncomfortable shooting manually, or extremely comfortable shooting on burst, I would leave the FAMAS on full auto, as its bursting mode seems to be nothing more than a gimmick at the present moment. Although, I will say that it is satisfying when you finally hit that single burst against a helmetless enemy, but with the current meta as it is, those rounds seem fewer and far between. Speaking of which, when should you buy the FAMAS? Now, that's a tough question. A year ago, I don't think anyone would have hesitated to suggest buying the FAMAS as an anti-eco or even force buy weapon. Nowadays, however, you see less and less of the FAMAS being used in the competitive meta, as they've been effectively replaced by UMPs. Truthfully, I don't think anyone is surprised, considering just how effective and efficient UMPs have been for both eco and anti-eco situations. Not only does the UMP cost a fraction of the price, but it also offers double the standard kill award, giving it heavy incentive over the FAMAS, especially with how important money management has been for the CT side. That being said, the FAMAS might still be the safer choice against eco rounds, provided that you play safely in a defensible position to exploit its longer effective range. After all, the pistol armor meta is still going strong. Nonetheless, even under the threat of overpowered pistols, most of the time buying an UMP against eco or save rounds is just too tempting of a prospect to resist, as the benefits seem to far outweigh the risk. For those reasons, I don't suggest buying the FAMAS for anti-eco rounds, unless you 1. Absolutely need to delay an enemy push for your teammates to rotate, 2. Are playing around near either halftime or match point, or 3. Are more comfortable playing a passive/stationary role, or are just confident in shooting with the FAMAS. As for the flip side, with its 2,250 price tag, the FAMAS is too heavy of an investment to be used without armor, and so is a very risky and unfeasible eco-round purchase. I mean, I suppose you could try, but unlike the Scout or Mag 7, it lacks significant one-shot lethality, making for a terrible glass cannon weapon. Now, for force buys, I do see much more potential, as buying a FAMAS over the M4 allows you to purchase more utility in the way of smokes, flashes, kits, etc., which can be invaluable to your team's success. But one of the biggest drawbacks to this is that the FAMAS clearly lacks the accuracy and damage values to evenly compete against other rifles at long-distance aim duels. That's primarily why I prefer using it at close to medium ranges, to somewhat even the odds. Because of this, I still find myself favoring the UMP in most force buy situations. Even though the FAMAS definitely provides more ranged utility, it's not too difficult to set up for CQC engagements, especially when defending a bomb site. Furthermore, dropping an UMP is definitely less painful than dropping a force bot FAMAS. So, in conclusion, there doesn't seem to be a definitive answer as to when or how to use the FAMAS in the new competitive meta. Most of it boils down to situation and preference. Shocker, I know. But because of the FAMAS's middling damage, poor inaccuracy, and relatively long reload time, 2,250 just seems like too much to pay for a mediocre rifle. Not when there are cheaper, more cost-effective weapon alternatives. So, while the FAMAS is undeniably still useful for both anti-eco and force buy rounds, the cost-effectiveness of the UMP and pistol armor is slowly but surely decreasing the FAMAS's overall usage in competitive play. Normally, after extensive usage of a weapon I plan on breaking down, I tend to get more comfortable with its core mechanics, and even start to enjoy using it. However, the FAMAS might be the only weapon I've covered that I genuinely felt disappointed with. It's not that I hated using the gun, but I always found it to be lacking, specifically with how insignificant the burst firing mode seemed to be. And believe me, it's not from a lack of trying. Burst mode.
Thing sucks!
That's not to say that I didn't play well using the FAMAS, but using it always felt so unnecessarily stressful, specifically against eco or save rounds. Purchasing a FAMAS for those rounds was pretty much like going all in. because if you lost, you'd most likely be broke going into the next round. It's like, even if you ended up winning the round, you'd still be losing cash by upgrading to a better rifle. Or, if you chose to keep the FAMAS on gun round, you'd basically have to play closer ranges to evenly compete against AK-47s. Both problems that could have been solved by buying a UMP. Again, the FAMAS is not a bad rifle, but it is disappointing, and sure could benefit from some balancing changes. Now, while the UMP probably needs to be nerfed with, say, a reduced kill award, I would much rather see the FAMAS get buffed to increase its competitive relevance. I mean, if the recent Negev changes are indicative of anything, it's that Valve sure does love to buff weapons with gimmicky changes. So I think buffing the FAMAS's burst firing mode would perfectly match their agenda, as well as giving the FAMAS some interesting and much needed upgrades. But in the end, that's just my opinion. I'm interested to see what you guys think about the FAMAS. Do you think it needs a buff? Or do other weapons need a nerf? Do you enjoy using it on burst? And if so, are you sick? Well, whatever the case, to me, it's still the most disappointing gun in CSGO.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.